Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this third and last Post-Inertia weekly talk. I'm Andreu Belsunces and I'm teacher at Escola Massana, the co-coordinator of the research team Port Zero, and one of the organizers of Post-Inertia. For those who are not familiar with Post-Inertia, with this school that is hosting this talk this evening, please let me give you some context. Post-Inertia is an online summer school devoted to rehearse and critically reflect on speculative practices and theory between philosophy, design, art, social sciences, and critical thinking. Post-Inertia is part of Port Zero, the speculative, critical, and future design research team of Escola Massana, a design and art school situated in the center of Barcelona. The school, Post-Inertia, has been organized to activate speculative tactics and concepts to tackle particular contemporary challenges, precisely because we wanted to further explore how a pragmatic take on speculative practice might work. The pandemic has opened a portal towards new, frightening, but also promising opportunities. Like Isabel Stengers claimed in 2013, when she published In Catastrophic Times, we should find a way to move from history 1, where we have to accept structural precarity and lack of real agency to decarbonize our civilization, to history 2, where resources can be evenly redistributed and our collective power is able to adjust and transform our societal and productive behavior towards a more just reality. To find possible ways to move from one stage to the other, Post-Inertia has created 4 working groups to speculate with. During the last 2 weeks and until next Friday, we'll be addressing areas like technological democratization, ecological transition and housing, biopractices, and care and affect. To do so, we are having amazing allies like the collectives and research groups Technopolitica, Holon, Biofriction, and Pirate Care. Post-Inertia proposed our international participants a journey from the abstract to the particular. We started with Andreas Weber, philosopher and biologist, who proposes a cultural and epistemic shift in relationship to the way we perceive ourselves as individual, society, and nature. In the second week, we had the sociologist and the design researcher Laura Forlano to show how social science methods can merge with speculative research to analyze the present and open and potentially destabilize what is yet to come. Today, we are very happy to welcome the sociologist and design theorist Benjamin Bratton, who has been a reference in our work during the last years, and particularly in his way of understanding speculative design as a discipline that must focus on what is so deeply functional as to be unlikely, and considering the future as something to be prevented as much as achieved. He helped us work our research as prefigurative, but more as a simulation than a symbolic performance. But before giving him the stage, let me introduce his work very, very briefly. Benjamin Bratton has been analyzing sociotechnical change for more than a decade. In his analysis of cultural implication of computing and globalization, Bratton bridged philosophical and aesthetic research, media studies, organizational planning, and strategy. Today, he will share some ideas about his last book, The Terraforming, where he establishes a key relationship between, 1, the climate crisis conceived as an abstract phenomena only seen and partially understood thanks to a planetary scale computation, and 2, an AI-driven automation conceived as an emergent phenomena whose consequences can lead us towards the social collapse. In his latest analysis, but also in former works like The Stack, Bratton engages narratives and philosophical frames like posthumanism and speculative realism in a personal accelerationist and xenofeminist way, especially when he writes, for example, we will reclaim the artificial not as in fake, but rather designed, as a foundation which links the mitigation of anthropogenic climate change to the geopolitics of automation. For this, urban-scale automation is seen as part of an expanded landscape of information, agency, labor, and energy that is part of a living ecology, not a substitute for one. With this, he claims for a new Copernican turn, where planning, reason, and global infrastructures apparatus and emergency sovereignty will help us redesign our planet to make it more livable for all its inhabitants. Well, Benjamin, thank you very much for being here this evening, and we are looking forward to see what you have to share with us.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity to join you tonight to share a little bit of the work we've done, of late. I thought, based on the series that have been put together around these issues of speculative design, in particular in the relationship to some of the political and cultural issues that just been identified, that the presentation that might make the most sense and that might generate the most interesting discussion for us, and it's certainly my hope that whether it's through the comments or however, that we're able to develop a bit of a back and forth, a Q&A on this, would be to present a bit of the work that we've done in the terraforming program at the Strelka Institute in Moscow. As some of you probably know, we've just wrapped up the first year of the terraforming program, which I'll explain in a little bit more detail. I think some extraordinary work came out of the research that we did together. And so, rather than explaining, trying to go in a bit deeper into the terraforming book as a theoretical text, separate from the kind of speculative design work that has been developed in relationship to it, it seemed to make more sense to actually to present the two of them together, so that we could have a bit of a discussion about the relationship between the projective models that have been articulated in the design in relationship to the theoretical, and vice versa, so that each of them might potentially inform one another, and we could also have some discussion as to whether or not they do so properly. So with that, let me go ahead and share my screen here for you, and I will have a presentation. We'll just sort of jump right into the presentation. So we're into it. So thanks once again for the invitation. This is for those of you who are a little bit less familiar with my work. These are some of the institutions where I'm located. My primarily at University of California, San Diego. I'm also, as mentioned, the program director at the Strelka Institute in Moscow, and have visiting appointments at SciArc Architecture School in Los Angeles, where I've taught since 2001. As well as NYU Shanghai and European Graduate School. The project that I'm probably most known for, and perhaps some of you have read, is this little pamphlet that I wrote for MIT Press a few years ago called The Stack, which, as mentioned, tries to lay out something like a sort of comprehensive political philosophy of planetary scale computation, but in a sort of historical, current, and in speculative modes. The book essentially makes two arguments. One is that the emergence of planetary scale computation has both distorted and deformed the traditional Westphalian models of political geography, as well as created new territories in its own image. And second, that we can see the emergence of planetary scale computation not as one single undifferentiated mega machine, but rather as something that operates in multiple different genres or species. And instead of seeing them all kind of spinning out on their own, we can actually understand them as forming something like a coherent whole that aligns layer by layer in a more modular sort of way into this vast, if incomplete, irregular, accidental megastructure, which we would call the stack, and indeed increasingly multiple such megastructures simultaneously. And roughly these work sort of this way: at the Earth layer, where ecological flows become sites of intensive sensing, quantification, and governance. A cloud computing layer that spurs platform economies, creates virtual geographies in its own image, where contemporary cloud platforms sometimes absorb traditional core functions of the state producing its own kind of irregular geographies, a city layer in which this vast discontiguous networks weave their borders into various enclaves and escape routes, a addressing layer at which locates billions and billions of entities and events into unfamiliar maps, an interface layer that prevents vibrant augmentations of reality, standing in for extended cognition, and finally a user layer occupied by both humans and non-humans that populate this tangled apparatus that we would call the stack. So that was the previous book project. This summer, I'm currently working on two books. One is working title, The Artificial, which is a theme that I'll address a little bit today, which is sort of the follow-up to the stack of a sort of much longer treatment, and a shorter one called Revenge of the Real, which we published by Verso early next year, that is on the pandemic. And is extrapolated from a short essay I wrote called 18 Lessons of Quarantine Urbanism, and that'll be out earlier next year. So the issue then that I want to talk about today in relationship to planetary scale computation has to do with this question of artificiality and indeed the compositionality of this condition. As opposed to simply identifying planetary scale computation as an infrastructural and sociocultural reality, there are two questions that we want to ask further from this. One is, in essence, more philosophical. What is revealed to us for the epistemology of planetary scale computation? What is to be gleaned from it, and how does it structure the possibility of thinking, and ultimately what constitutes our understanding of planetarity? And second, how is the compositionality of that circumstance, the way in which it gets made, both an application or reflection of that epistemology, and indeed how does it in fact produce that epistemology? How does the actual, let's say, the material labor of remaking the Earth produce the philosophical conditions, but also how is in doing so does this reveal circumstances that then inform that condition? Now, I'll talk a little bit about that dynamic in a moment. As mentioned, as promised, one of the things I wanted to talk about today, and I'll show some of this work, has to do with this postgraduate research program at the Strelka Institute, which I've been directing now for 4 years. Before we get into the terraforming, just to catch everyone up, the previous program that we did was called The New Normal, and it was ran for 3 years. I'll just quickly show a few of the projects that came out of that program. One is called SAISH. SAISH was a project that took place that was sited in the city of Korgos in Kazakhstan, right on the Chinese border. And what SAISH is looking at is this strange infrastructural phenomenon by which the Chinese railroad and the Russian railroad operate on different gauge systems. The Russian railroad systems is a bit wider than most international railway systems, which was originally planned so that they couldn't get it, the external invaders couldn't use the rail lines. But at this point where you're trying to move cargo from China through Russia to Europe, Korgos is this dry dock port in the middle of the desert where trains come, they stop, and then workers move containers off of the Chinese trains onto the Russian trains, one container at a time, so that they can be sent across their way. It's this amazing kind of patch system, and one that raises any number of peculiar, even surreal issues about the nature of infrastructural sovereignty.
Citizenship and sovereignty were traditionally rooted in territorial belonging. But as transnational flows of people, capital, goods, and information continue to expand, this conception is undermined. Current crisis of citizenship can be explained as conflicts over the infrastructures that sustain these flows. Belt and Road Initiative, a Chinese-led long-term plan to generate a Eurasian trade zone around the Old Silk Road, affects 65% of global population and is the most ambitious contemporary infrastructure project.
So so the SAGE project is a film, but also a piece of software that we developed. The researcher group flew to Korgos in Kazakhstan to develop the film.
Korgos Triport is a logistic enclave between two infrastructural and political realities. Automation of logistics in border condition relies heavily on cross-jurisdictional interactions, shared databases, and the implementation of sensing systems ruled by code. SAGE is a platform that enables independent organizations to design and manage techno-legal procedures of information exchange, acting as an interface between legal and data workflows.
So one of the things we know as well, it's possible for the objects to move across site from one corner to the other. The persons who actually work there is far less easier. So what SAGE is essentially is a visual programming language for the automation of credentials necessary for persons to move between the multiple zones of this highly artificial jurisdictional construction in the middle of the desert in Kazakhstan, which we take to a certain extent as being kind of as a microcosm in a way of this differential dynamic between object sovereignty and human sovereignty in the ability to move between different kinds of conditions within global spaces more broadly. But obviously our other interest in this particular site as this strange infrastructural switching point is also clear. Another project called Altai. Altai was looking at coding systems, particularly coding systems, things like UPC, things like QR codes, and developed an elaborate software for the organization and generation of QR codes and other kinds of symbolic signatures that would encode and decode much more complex forms of information. An earlier project called Patternist was an urban-based AR game based on the Octavia Butler's fiction about the organization, the identification and organization of minerals and geology within the fiction of the story from distant planets, which you organize around the world around you, which is now in a sort of multiple, I think, fourth version of the game by now. Doma was a project that we developed that looked at housing economies, particularly in Eastern Europe, and had developed a blockchain-based real estate cooperative system for these areas that would allow for greater access greater access to the urban real estate market for those who live there. GeoCinema was a project that we developed that was looking at planetary scale sensing, visualization, and modeling apparatuses as a kind of vast, discontiguous global camera, and asked the question of ultimately what kind of cinema does this mega apparatus imply, and what kind of cinema is possible in terms of the ways in which it challenges the singularity of positions of viewership and duration and temporality. Shift was a project that also was another project around automation that was looking at the role of automation in particularly in the Russian trucking industry, and had developed a system for the outfitting of existing trucking fleets with semi-autonomous systems that would allow the owner-operators of these systems to continue to work even as the larger driverless fleets were appearing. That their knowledge of the routes, the knowledge of the road would create a kind of data commons and that this would, in essence, become the basis of what the Truckers Union would allow, would coordinate.
Логистика, как основа мировой экономики, находится на передовой автоматизации. Крупнейшие в мире порты почти полностью автоматизированы. В целях оптимизации процессов и сокращения расходов человеческое участие сведено к минимуму. Следующим шагом в эволюции грузоперевозок является автоматизация и наземной логистики. Автоматизация лоббируется автопроизводителями, которые видят возможность сменить собственную экономическую модель и взять под контроль всю логистическую цепочку. От порта до конечного потребителя. Таким образом, традиционная модель грузоперевозок, основанная на индивидуальном владении транспортом, трансформируется в более централизованную. Однако в таком случае автопроизводители полностью вытеснят владельцев грузовиков из индустрии.
Ну, вожу уже где-то около 10 лет. Короче, с 19 лет я вот за рулем на трассе езжу. Ну, эти автопилоты-то сейчас на всех грузовиках стоят. У нас машины тоже старые, у кого-то работают, у кого-то не работают. У меня, например, тоже работает, но это автопилот тоже такая вещь. С ней тоже нельзя все время увлекаться. Семьи там большие очень. По трое, по четверо, где-то по шестеро даже детей. И всех надо не то, чтобы там прокормить, даже обеспечить.
Okay, I'm going to just stop this here. All of this work is on the Strelka website, so you can go a little bit deeper into it. I want to just give a little bit of a summary of some of the previous work that we've done, so you get a little sense of how the terraforming works differently. In a nutshell, the terraforming project and the program that we've developed can be defined as thus: the comprehensive project to fundamentally transform Earth's cities, technologies, and ecosystems, to ensure that the planet will be capable of supporting Earth-like life. Artificiality, astronomy, and automation form the basis of that planetarity. So to be clear, there's really three terraformings that we're talking about here. One is a kind of reconsideration of the last few hundred years, let's say the era of what's called the Anthropocene, understood as a kind of headless, accidental terraforming project that the last 200 years have managed to accomplish for better and worse. The second would be the understanding that regardless of what we do at this point going forward, that we being the entirety of the Homo sapiens and industrial civilization more specifically, will continue to terraform the Earth regardless of what we do going forward. That in essence, the question of terraforming is not optional. It is a kind of the terraforming scale effects are inevitable going forward. And that third, given that, doing the organization, composition, and articulation of a more rational and equitable terraforming in the decades to come constitutes, in a way, the kind of meta design project. Since we're speaking in speculative design vernacular, the meta design project that all of our energies should be trained upon getting it properly. In the introduction, this notion of a Copernican turn was identified, and I'll speak to that very quickly. Part of the argument here is that there are particular kinds of anthropocentric and anthropomorphic conceits that are behind the earlier terraforming that have caused no end of problems and grief for us. A Copernican turn is, if you think to the astronomy, movement from geocentric to heliocentric cosmologies was a kind of decentering of the human. It was a shifting of our understanding of ourselves at the center of a solar system to one in which we understand ourselves within a larger matrix and structure. To our way of thinking, these kinds of Copernican turns and Copernican traumas, as Freud called them, are priceless accomplishments. And they would include not just things like astronomy, but also Darwinian biology, neuroscience, biotechnology, any of the ways in which our kind of intuitive, naturalistic, and self-congratulatory understanding of the world and our role in it is unwound and unmade by some form of a scientific or technical disenchantment or discovery by which we actually understand how the world works rather differently. So in a more specific, sort of like more technical definition for us, a Copernican turn would be that based on some complex conceptualization of how the world works, we would create some kind of technical means by which we would be able to perceive the world differently than they could through our natural senses, such as a telescope or a microscope, or computation. And through the way in which the world is revealed to work, the way in which we actually understand how the world or the universe or microbes actually do work through this technical instrumentation, demonstrates that the original concept that we had when we made this technical instrument is actually invalid and is undermined in some important way. And so there has to be this kind of reconciliation process between the idea that produces the technical means that reveals the world works differently, and then this kind of disenchantment, decentering, or destabilization that happens subsequent to this. This emphasis on how it is that technical systems can produce this disenchantment or a kind of destabilization, alienation as the basis of this epistemological progress in the form of the Copernican turn is something that informs a lot of our interest in how we define technology and how we think about its purpose. Now, as opposed to some other sort of ways in which I don't really consider myself a speculative realist in the conventional sense. I think that there's certain theorists from that era, Ray Zanagarastani or Ray Brossier, who I think our work is very well aligned with, and others probably not aligned at all. And those are not aligned are ones in which that the idea that the notion that the implications of SR is somehow that we would have less agency, that the compositionality of our capacities to artificially construct a world would be diminished, are ones that we don't necessarily agree with. That in fact, that by puncturing the illusions of human exceptionalism, that the artificiality of our agency means that the planetary to come would be even more technologically configured and anthropogenic. And this is kind of a key idea in relationship to our theories of climate change, is to put it simply, that anthropogenic climate change, that our response to anthropogenic climate change will need to be equally anthropogenic. And the sooner that we accept the artificiality of that circumstance, the better. Now, for those who are interested, that all of this is sort of laid out in much more eloquent detail than I can provide in a quick talk here today in this book called The Terraforming, much shorter than the stack, but 30,000 words, which, if you like, you can download for free here for purposes of the talk. I just uploaded an EPUB of the book. If you want to quickly do a screen grab or write down the address here, you're welcome to download the book itself and have a read on it. It was written last summer in a kind of 6-week sprint, and it functions in many ways as kind of in essence the kind of manifesto or design brief for the program that we've developed. So please make use of it as you like. A couple of the ideas that work with here. One is around this idea of 2030 and the ways in which this date has been invoked both as a kind of deadline for substantive unless there's a really radical transformation of the decarbonization of our economy, that in order to keep temperatures below civilization wrecking degrees, that unless those transformations happen by this date, that whatever happens afterwards will be relatively inconsequential. This, invoked on slightly mythical terms, of course. We also noticed that this date of 2030 is invoked quite a lot around issues of automation. That unless that there is we really get a handle on the socio-political and economic consequences of automation by 2030, that the runaway effects of this will be ultimately unmanageable. And began to sort of wonder whether or not this dynamic between how it is that what it would mean to get a handle on decarbonization and on automation, perhaps these are in fact not two different projects, but are ones in which that are deeply interrelated with one another. That the question of the response of decarbonization and it will be reliant on automation, and that the proper socio-political and economic application of automation is one that needs to be focused on decarbonization. The structure of cities, as we're looking about it because ours is an urban design program, has to do with less of cities as kind of is these kind of indigenous settlements, but rather as a kind of feature of the crust of the planet that are folded and structured in particular ways that allow for circulation and occupation. And the question of circulatory occupation, as opposed to sort of fixed inhabitation, is both part of the way in which we think about cities, but also the way in which we think about things like open borders, as opposed to more nativist perspectives. Now, I was asked to talk a little bit about the artificial. One of the ways in which this comes up a bit has to do with a particular dismantling, if you like, of conventional nature cultural dynamics, and particularly in the European West. This structure of a kind of ontological distinction between the natural and the artificial has origins that are both theologic and territorial. That the segmentation of land and territories and the landscape into urban zones and wilderness zones appears in essence simultaneously. At the beginning, particularly in the early industrial era, appears simultaneously with the appearance of the philosophical construction of both the natural as a kind of fictitious formulation of the world in a particular way, as differentiated from the artificial, and also the construction of the artificial as a kind of some sort of like Promethean contamination of this natural realm. Thinking of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein early in 1818 as the kind of a sort of signal moment here. Now, it's for sure, we know from Levi-Strauss and anthropology, there's the notion of the raw and the cooked, that there's some kind of differentiation of nature and culture seems to have some kind of anthropological constant, but one that is ultimately quite itself kind of artificial. Now, the notion of the artificial as we are as we work it here, which is one that I think should be quite useful to design thinking, is not one in which not a connotation of the artificial as a kind of as in fake, as in something that is that is fictitious or that is false in some way, but rather the artificial as in composed, or the artificial as in deliberately constructed. And the sort of more basic generation of sort of defining artificiality within complex systems we would hold it has to do with the identification of some form of anomalous regularity. Anomalous regularity. And as you see here in this image of these trees planted in a forest in Japan, this is not a photoshopped image, that it is the anomalous regularity of the particular patterns that we can instantly see that there was some hand of design in the construction of this structure kind of pattern. Or another example might be the way in which astronomers think about those who were involved in the SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, would be listening to otherwise entropic radio signals from deep space, relatively well unstructured, and then on the rare occasion that they would receive a signal that was that had anomalous regularity, that it was in some kind of rhythm or sequence or pattern or structure that could not have happened all by itself. That the presumption there that something or someone or somewhere must have deliberately composed or designed this. This is the connotation of artificiality, that this is an artificial signal, they are called. And this is the connotation that we're thinking about. Another example of this might be throughout a lot of Africa and Asia and Europe, that for centuries people would find these flint arrowheads. These sort of around and they're originally thought to be, they were called thunderstones. The lightning had caused these things as well. But eventually we'll be able to figure that there is an anomalous regularity in the chip marks at the end of these that would indicate that they were in fact prehistoric tools that were used as the users go. But again, it's this concept of an anomalous regularity, the deliberate composition of a system that implies the kind of trace of agency within the technical mechanism that is the connotation of artificiality that we are interested in. And it's one that, again, forms the basis of what we think of the anthropogenic response to anthropogenic climate change. All right, so the terraforming book, which I've asked you to have a look at, again, goes through this in considerable more detail, but just to sort of give you a kind of drive-by of some of the things, some of the ideas that populate this. We can think of this in terms of, we'll call it the 11 assumptions that we make as the basis of the speculative design work that we take on. I'll go through these real quickly before I show you some of the work that we came out of the terraforming program, and then we can open it up to some conversation. The first is that in part of the implication of planetary scale computation, what Peter Haft calls the technosphere, the development, the wrapping of the Earth in a sensing instrumental weave, the calculative infrastructure that extends all the way down to subterranean cloud platforms, out into the ring of satellites, pointing both in and out, it constitutes a kind of sensory apparatus for the planet itself. If you think of things like the black hole image that was produced by this network of telescopes working together. Crucially, this was a picture not taken by a person from space like the blue marble, but rather was a picture taken by the planet itself. And so as a starting point, we want to understand that when we're talking about planetarity in the planet, that we're talking about a planet that itself has some capacity for self-knowledge and self-understanding, not and in a way is using us as the mechanism and the medium for that. Second, the concept of climate change is an epistemological accomplishment of planetary scale computation. So if asked in isolation, the question of how is the planetary scale computation can contribute to the conceptual shifts and applied interventions in and against climate change, if it's asked by itself, we need to also understand that in important ways, climate change as an idea, climate change in quotes, climate change as a concept, is an epistemological accomplishment of planetary scale computation because of the sensory apparatuses and the uses of this megastructure for weather modeling, for temperature measurement, and so forth and so on, and as the basis of Earth science, as the fundamental instrument of Earth science, in the same way the telescope is an instrument of astronomy or microscope is an instrument of virology. That this planetary scale computation is the instrument of Earth science. That it's only because of this that we have this idea in the first one. The notion of climate change as an empirically validated statistical pattern drawn from a comprehensive planetary scale biopolitical sensing, surveillance, modeling, and calculation apparatus is where we have this idea in the first place. So it is this most artificial of innovations, the stack itself, that has made this most significant artificial abstraction, climate change, into a legible and communicable concept. Third, climate change mitigation and pervasive automation must converge. As said, the response to climate change may depend on how we deal with the implications of a more pervasive, algorithmically governed automation, and particularly in relationship to governance. And while the response to crisis of automation may depend on how we deal with the implication of decarbonization, molecular governance, and the reverse of diversity loss. In this sense, the question of automation should be seen as inside the question of climate change and cannot be engaged otherwise, while the question of climate change is inside the question of automation and can't be into otherwise. And so the question of what we do with the automation needs to be focused on this as well. Now, if thinking about this more generally in terms of the kind of resource efficiencies that are necessary and resource rationalizations are necessary, thinking about the logic of the kinds of design logics that are necessary, that are not dependent upon some kind of naturalistic fantasy of reversing circumstances to some kind of prelapsarian homeostasis. The maximization of the equitability of resource allocations, particularly after political interventions like massive carbon taxes, may result in understanding that it's in fact design forms like this that are the kind of green architecture that we need to be paying attention to. But with that in mind, we don't define automation as some kind of only as a hyper contemporary innovation, but rather we understand automation as a general principle by which ecosystems work and have always worked. We would define automation not as the synthetic transference of natural human agency into some external technical systems. I mean, it can be that, but that's not it exclusively. But rather, automation is the general condition by which action and abstraction are codified into complex adaptive relays through living bodies and non-living media. So this more ecological conception of automation is where the conditions that are revealed by the intensification of algorithmic intelligence today are made clear. Automation in general then is understood as the basis by which some kind of decision is encoded in the relay system. If you think about a kind of Rube Goldberg contraption of kinetic energy moving through a system of heterogeneous parts, any sort of point within that system that some kind of abstracted decision can be codified into one of the relay points. This is really what we understand automation to mean. Fifth, the term geoengineering must be redefined. It must be redefined to imply a scale of design effect, not just a type of technology. One of the ways, and then sort of thinking about the collapse of this nature-culture divide, is perhaps a reappropriation, or just, or perhaps we need a new word, but of geoengineering to include much more than new claims for cloud seeding, for example. It should refer to a scale of design, and more specifically to a scale of design effect, including and preventing carbon sinks from being destroyed. So, for example, returning the Amazon rainforest to its pre-industrial scale and footprint and density so that its functions as a carbon sink could be renewed. This too is a form of geoengineering. So the program of geoengineering needs to be framed not as some kind of omniscient and reductive control of ecological mechanisms, but rather as the sober, practical, and geotechnically minded coming to grips with the artificiality and effects of anthropogenic ecological intervention. And we see this in different ways. And so the kinds of geoengineering that when I talk about the scale of design effect, this doesn't necessarily imply that is positive. On the left, you have the Amazonian, the fires in the Brazilian Amazon previous year. On the right, you had fires in Siberia that were happening simultaneously. Arguably, the neglect, the deliberate neglect and mismanagement of these ecosystems that would allow for these fires to take place. This is also a kind of geoengineering scale intervention, but one that we would identify rather as negative. So again, geoengineering is understood as a scale of design, intervention, and composition rather than a list, rather than a kind of a portfolio of particular technologies. And in this sense, one would not be pro or anti geoengineering in the sense in which we recognize that there is both positive and negative implications and applications of geoengineering as a scale design effect, including these fires, for example, but rather understand that engineering as a scale is one in which it is a scale design intervention that is no longer never has been, but it probably is no longer negotiable in its implication. It's also one that we need to understand a bit in terms of the agency of geoengineering and who makes these kinds of decisions. One of the faculty in our program for this year was Kim Stanley Robinson, who allowed us to. We read a pre-release copy of his next novel, Ministry of the Future. And in Ministry of the Future, I'm not giving anything away, but in the Ministry of the Future, the geoengineering plays a very important role in the story. In this story, the geoengineering schemes are not deployed by some kind of first world Dr. Evil character, but rather by an equator adjacent government who has just watched hundreds of thousands of its people die in a heat wave. They may look to the north and say, you have no moral standing to tell us not to try this. And indeed they don't. And so they try it and it works out or not. And so it's not necessarily Peter Thiel or someone like that we need to be looking at in terms of the first movers in terms of geoengineering. It may in fact be more like Bangladesh. Sixth, necessary and fundamental shifts in geotechnology are likely to precede necessary and fundamental shifts in geopolitics. Here's where the relationship between the Copernican turn in technical systems and the Copernican turn in political systems begin to come together. When we have a situation a bit like some of these geoengineering technologies where you can't use this technology at this particular scale and effect without also changing the political and cultural mechanisms that employ them, then circumstances like this that I suggest here may come about. That is, to radically expand the range of techniques available would also alter the very notion of the geopolitics that would be necessary to make use of those systems. There's a certain presumption that dealing with the climate change and that by dealing with climate change in relationship to things like ethics and morality and politics equals a radical change, whereas interest in technology equals a defense of the status quo. And actually, we would want to actually suggest that the opposite is perhaps more true. To govern a geotechnology that is capable of making the necessary differences may require the emergence of a new kind of geopolitics that would never have appeared otherwise. And so we're totally open to the idea that the geopolitical may precede the geotechnical. But we suggest that we would also argue that we need to allow for the fact that the geotechnical transformation may be the thing that brings about the transformation in geopolitics. And if we think about the history of technology and the history of political systems over the last 500, 600 years, we may see evidence that this is in fact the norm. 7, surveillance flows of carbon are better than of individual humans. That the question of the planet as a sensory apparatus implies an identification and governance of material systems like carbon flows. Call it surveillance if you want, but a surveillance and governance of material systems, not necessarily a surveillance and governance of individual humans, which is, I think, many cases part of the problem, is that we would have governing systems that would be organized around the observation and measurement of individual humans. It is, in our way of thinking, symptomatic of the fact that we actually think that is the organization and optimization of the agency and desire of individual humans that constitutes the question of governance in the first place. We take a far less anthropocentric view of what planetary governance would mean. But one way to think about this is thinking about what Paul Edwards called the vast machine of climate science is itself a set as a kind of is this enormous structure of instrumental sensing media, sub-oceanic nerves, atmospheric orbital antenna, and the rest of this, and so forth and so on. That the capacity of this system to create a model of the whole is already available to us. The question is, what are the relevant sort of variables within the structure as well, and how it is that we might use this less as a sort of means for the kind of the policing of individual persons, but rather for a shifting in the logic of governance and its biopolitics from the observation and mediation of the voice, will, and desire of aggregate Homo sapiens, and rather into the organization and rationalizations of material flows that would constitute the basis of a viable planetarity for those. This is a very different kind of geopolitics and a very different kind of geoeconomics. 8, energy infrastructures based on long-term waste cycles are desirable. I'm going to skip through here, but there's a long research that we've done on next generation nuclear power, which is very interesting for us. 9, for ecological carrying capacity, culture costs more than science. So when considering the enormous planetary, for the physical appetite of planetary scale computation, it's important to differentiate priorities and applications. The entire footprint of Earth science, sensors and satellites and servers, is totally insignificant in comparison with the carbon and energy costs of computing human self-expression. Human self-expression, whether in the form of Instagram, YouTube, whatever, this is the thing that ultimately is the thing that's producing this enormous ecological impact of the computation itself. It was not climate science that broke the internet. It was the semiotics of celebrity bodies. So what we use for this hot heaving cloud engine that we're concerned about is stoked in pursuit of moments of apparently meaningful performance and fleeting significance. And in this sense, it's a critique, not just a critique of a cultural critique, but a critique of culture itself as a necessary good in its own right in relationship to this shift in the biopolitics of planetary governance that we are interested in. And back to the nature-culture divide just for a moment. We found that it's much easier to discuss with people the idea that the idea of nature is a kind of make-believe social construction, that there really isn't an idea of nature. But if this is the case, that nature is in fact kind of fictitious in this regard, then within the nature-culture divide, this would also imply that culture is equally fictitious in this regard, at least as it's conceived in relationship to this dynamic. This is a much more difficult pill for people to swallow, we find. Lastly, last 2, alternative planetarity requires a philosophy in and of outer space. The modern sense of planetarity comes from how we reside on Earth, how we reside on the Earth of old-fashioned technologies that allowed the planet to see itself from the outside and then to see itself deep in its own predicament. That the concept, how it is that the notion of a world transformed into the notion of a planet, which we think really began to sort of the key rotations began with the space age in the 60s and 70s. That the real discovery of the space program was the discovery of Earth itself as a planet. So thinking and finding the limits of our planetary perch and to think about ways to bend them again, this is also part of what the Copernican turn implies. So from the ground, we look up into space, and from there we look down to Earth to orient what planetarity would mean. We can think of it this way. Imagine, as you see here, an image of in this case, an astronaut, though cosmonauts went first in the spacewalk. A picture of an astronaut on a spacewalk. We could interpret this image in a couple different ways. One is we see a figure here of this a figure of radiating agency. Even as he, quote, may appear to himself as this kind of executive agent incarnate. But instead of seeing, this ultimate frontier puncturing space cowboy, we could also see instead a kind of fragile animal, unable to leave his home without bringing an artificial atmosphere with him as he toddles outward. He is tethered to multiple umbilical cords, re-encased in an inorganic placenta, without which the creature would instantly die. And then in a snap, we understand that their condition is not some superhuman exception, but is the same as ours here on the surface. We too would die without our automated life support systems. So what at first glance looks like autonomous self-governance is, upon closer inspection, always a condition decided in advance by remote agents and relays. We, like this astronaut on a spacewalk, we evolved in a kind of complementary relationship with the artificial technical apparatuses around us as a species. And without this, we don't exist. Without this, the Homo sapien as a species, separate from its technological entanglements, is nothing. So lastly, and then we'll see what we want to do next. As mentioned earlier, as a definition of speculative design, we look at speculative design. The program that we've identified is one of speculative urban futures, not only because of each of these these terms is undecided and therefore in degree alive, but for us, as said, the speculative refers not to the kind of the whimsically creative from some kind of blank page tabula rasa, but as the design of what is so functional and necessary, even if also equally unlikely, that it makes conventional schemes, however likely those are to be repeated, seem insane by comparison. And in many sense, this is our predicament. Not only is business as usual psychotic, but the normal genres of concerned response are deeply neurotic and even delusional. So what we see here Galina Balashova, the designer of many of the Russian spacecraft, which I have a longer discourse on her, which I'll leave to the side. But in this, space design is defined directly as designed for a continuance of livability in an extremely inhospitable emergency environment, outer space. And nevertheless, the beauty of some of the habitats designed for such conditions tell us about the kinds of habitats and relationships to that technical entanglement that we should be considering here on the crust of Earth's surface. That is, from emergency comes emergence. Creativity doesn't come from a blank page, but from constraints that are so deep and weird that no commonsensical response is even possible. So last point, and then we'll see, is that one of the kind of slogan terms for the New Normal program was "the future has not been canceled," which was kind of riff based on conversations with Mark Fisher and others. When it was meant to say that the future was not some the idea was that self-validating and auto-perpetuating the collapse scenarios do not necessarily make a plan, but it was also a way to call on the history of Russian utopian thought and science fiction, futurism, as inheritances to claim more generally. However, with that reference, in the early 20th century, the idea of the future was an aspiration to be achieved. The future was something to be achieved. Today, however, the future seems less like something to be achieved than something to be prevented. And in this sense, speculative thought must be mobilized to the task of preventing one future so as another might, with some luck, come to pass. A future that is achieved because it is prevented. Okay, so now I want to ask you, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And I want to ask then your thoughts on whether or not I have 3 projects that I could show from the new terraforming program. It really depends on the time that you have left. Each of them, I've edited the video down to about 10-12 minutes each. We could watch none of them. We could watch all of them. We could watch one of them. We could just go to an open discussion now. I could provide your viewers the link to these videos, and they could watch them, the playlist for these to watch them themselves. But I'm at your disposal to use the rest of the time as you would like, to look at more of the work or to discuss or whatever you wish.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Maybe you can show one of the projects, and then we can start with the questions.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So here, let me ask you. So I'll let you pick the one. So there's 3 projects that we did 9 projects this year. You pass along the playlist for those who wish to watch them all. One is a project called Cosmos Law, which looks at the history and future of space law, and space law as a kind of planetary scale jurisdiction. The second one, To Bury the Sky, looks at direct air carbon capture and the infrastructures that are necessary for large-scale negative emissions technologies, and develops a rather detailed scheme for these in Siberia. The third Black Almanac is looking at the artificiality of food being this fundamental agriculture being this sort of fundamental early terraforming technology, and the ways in which our food cultures are nevertheless beholden to certain kinds of skeuomorphic naturalistic fallacies to the detriment of the kinds of food systems we might need in the future. Do any of those strike you as particularly appropriate to the conversation that your group has been having so far?
Yeah, maybe you can focus on the third one because it's related to especially to one of the groups.
So the food one in particular?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so let me pull that one up, and I'll play that video, and then we can go to our conversation from there. Okay, are you seeing my screen now? Yes, you should be, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
The terraforming program at the Strelka Institute could be defined as the search for a viable artificial plan for an alternative planetarity. One of the least viable aspects of our current planetary operations is the way that we metabolize the energy to power cities, industries, and ourselves in the form of food. In 2050, there will be 9.7 billion people on Earth. In order to feed them, the global food system will need to produce 70% more calories than it currently does, and must do so in a way that is equitable, nutritious, ecologically sustainable, and carbon negative. What might that look like? There are already clues. Chernozem, or Black Earth, is the most fertile soil on the planet. It can be found on the Eurasian steppe, the North American prairies, and in the Amazon basin, where it is known as terra preta. Terra preta is an absorbent, regenerative soil, rich in minerals and microbial life. It was formed when indigenous farmers threw bones, waste, and shattered pottery on the ground outside their kitchens, and then enhanced the soil with charcoal. Black soil, then, is artificial, an anthropogenic process of terraformation that was designed and managed to benefit both humans and the land. Agriculture has always terraformed, but it is not only food and landscapes that are produced. For thousands of years, farmers have collected rain tables, seed cycles, and lunar charts in almanacs, portable databases of earth science and prediction that standardized agricultural practice and were sites for speculation about man's place within the cosmos. When crop rotation, irrigation, and domesticated cattle were adopted in Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and the Indus Valley, they brought writing, taxation, and urban settlement with them, establishing dietary staples and farming models that remain in place today. Harnessing the chemical power of plants and cereals, territory, and climate, humans created a synthetic landscape that exploded with the arrival of nitrogen and phosphate fertilizers, deployed to secure the yields required by a growing population. Food and culture are indivisibly entwined. In Sumer, grain was offered to the gods before being tallied, apportioned, and stored in granaries outside the temple. When the gods didn't eat, the people did, cementing the link between ritual ingestion and societal complexity. But the connection goes deeper still. When humans eat, molecules bind with sensory receptors in the mouth and retronasal passageway, activating spatial patterns in the olfactory bulb as we breathe out. These signals combine with information from the other senses to form a neural cascade that passes through the emotion and memory process structures in the brain before becoming conscious perception. The experience of flavor, then, is as automatic as breathing, yet as intimate as dreaming. What's more, the food molecules we sense evolved to carry out specific functions like communication between plants, self-defense, or to respond to environmental shifts. In a quite literal sense, we can taste the operations of the biosphere. Because these molecules combine with images, language, and memory, we can taste ideology as well. Most of the food we encounter in our day-to-day lives is not intended for consumption. Instead, we see simulated images of food in the form of advertising, product packaging, on menus, supermarket shelves, and social media, building on a semiotics of agrarian simplicity and limitless nature that we first encounter as children. Consider the major food trends of the 2010s. Fast food classics elevated for a fast casual audience. Sentimental localism and fake rusticity reproduced for the global market. In food, as in music, we are stuck in a stylistic feedback loop defined by skeuomorphism and conservatism, undernourished by slick remixes of last century's genres. Think about the food served on airplanes. This is not food designed to embrace the particular conditions of gastronomy at high altitude, but an attempt to recreate cafe culture in the sky. Pigments are added to the carrots so they appear fresh. The lasagna is colored to look as though oven-baked. Food becomes little more than a tool to manufacture normalcy at 30,000 feet, and it is to this performance which all research and development capital flows. Yet there are interruptions to this process. The so-called horse meat scandal of 2013, in which beef lasagnas turned out to contain horse skin, wood chippings, and other scrapings from a series of factories across Europe, revealed an ontological breach between consumers and the food they eat. But it also demystified the means of industrial production at continental scale. Similarly, in 2020, when states began urging citizens to eat the surpluses of Wagyu beef, Belgian fries, and French cheese that had begun to mount during the early stages of the COVID-19 outbreak, a bit like wartime rationing in reverse, they revealed a series of automated supply chains that could be steered to greater ends. Displays of abundance have been instrumentalized throughout history to indicate the general health of the system that produced it. Yet the plenitude of a corporate organic market is a lie, which has the inverse effect of making shopping seem like a radical act. And still, the sentimental association of A is for apple and B is for banana, first encountered in children's books, remains the veil behind which geochemical meltdown is disguised. The processes by which we convert the biotic surface of the Earth and make it edible are responsible for almost a third of total greenhouse gas emissions, 75% of all deforestation, and the vast majority of biodiversity loss. Agriculture uses 70% of total freshwater withdrawals and has already degraded half the planet's soil. At the same time, at least 1.3 billion tons of food are wasted every year, and 1 in 3 people are malnourished. 3/4 of the birds alive today are farmed poultry. The accumulation of chicken bones in landfill sites since 1950 is considered a large enough entry in the fossil record to signal the commencement of the Anthropocene. There is no condition of pastoral innocence to which we can return. In fact, liberating food from the performance of an idealized past may require more alienation rather than less. Czarny Almanach, or Black Almanac, embraces artificiality and the chemical material potential of food as a locus for planetary transformation. It's a plan for 2050 that outlines 31 fundamental steps, from infrastructure to institutions, 1 per growing season, to construct a viable food system by the autumn of that year. The first change must be to the way we fund agriculture. We are often taught that a suspicion of new tastes, textures, experiences, and sensations is the primary obstacle for emerging food cultures to overcome. But there is an economic barrier too. More than $1 million of public money is spent every minute on subsidies that fund destructive farming practices and determine the ingredients, recipes, and products we consume. This hidden infrastructure is the reason farmers cannot grow the crops best suited to their land, and why the principal function of American agribusiness is the distribution and reformulation of corn syrup and soy. The shift in attitude towards lobster, once considered a parasite suitable only for fertilizer and animal feed, or the incorporation of a Japanese raw fish diet into the global mainstream, might provide a roadmap for insect proteins, precision fermentation, and cellular meat. What it teaches is that edibility is not innate in things, but is contingent upon knowledge, practice, and accessibility. We already eat insects in the form of food coloring. We eat copper, iron, and zinc to improve our health. We regularly ingest that which might seem harmful and use harmful substances to suggest edibility, as in food photography, where meat is basted with motor oil to glisten on cue, and ice cream is more likely to be dyed wall filler than anything that could melt under a hot studio light. Children's books and marketing are not the only means by which food cultures are engineered. After the Russian Revolution, apartments were built without kitchens in order to free families from the burden of bourgeois household economy. Instead, neighbors were to eat in canteens known as factory kitchens, a public feeding infrastructure in which mass production and communal dining were combined to balance nutrition with the erratic surpluses and deficits of the planned economy. What might a new factory kitchen include if it were built around a concept of planetary cuisine? Fast food is often criticized, but slow food cannot scale to meet our requirements. Movements like molecular gastronomy maximize hedonic pleasure at the expense of nourishment. Yet the design of food for space travel, another possibility for culinary innovation, reveals an archive of nourishment without desire. A contemporary factory kitchen would utilize the full potential of platform food and incorporate technologies suited to intensive agriculture at the urban scale. When food is labeled according to its true cost, flavor becomes a cognitive engine that kickstarts the geoengineering process by aligning our appetites with molecular elements and flows. We were not the first species to terraform Earth. 2.4 billion years ago, cyanobacteria began producing oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis, wiping out the majority of nitrogen-dependent life forms and triggering the first ice age. Blue-green algae has already transformed the planet and might soon do so again. Algae is a mineral-rich food source that can be grown in all weathers and harvested year-round. In Moscow, spirulina has been successfully trialed as a means to filter river water, and in Copenhagen, it forms the main input for a range of specialty caviar. And there are other non-human alchemists already working at planetary scale. Deep subsurface bacteria accounts for 13% of the planet's biomass. Scientists at biotech venture Join Bio are using synthetic biology to modify soil microbes so they can synthesize nitrogen directly from the atmosphere, boosting yields while reducing the need for industrial fertilizers. In Shandong province, China, cockroaches are being used to process food and kitchen waste, a trial run for a new system that safely consumes all food by producing new food for humans. Given their potential as a source of protein and a rich history of insect gastronomy from South America, Africa, and Asia, the place of crickets, beetles, mealworms, and locusts in the food system to come is already assured. When the space probes Voyager 1 and 2 left Earth in 1977, their payload included a golden record that contained images of food provision and consumption, raising a behavior that might seem banal or incidental to one of cosmic, even species-defining scope. Systematic agriculture emerged out of the black soil of the Nile River Delta, a technical laboratory from which the words alchemy and chemistry also descend. Almanacs, like diets, recipes, and cookbooks, are not only instructions for transforming matter. They are protocols for the production of self and society, foregrounding a process of decomposition and recombination that is the central logic of both chemistry and cooking. Humans account for just 0.01% of Earth's biomatter, a tiny fraction that needs to be recast according to its capacities and responsibilities. Yet even within that 0.01% live billions of microorganisms in the hair, throat, stomach, and gut, ancient invaders that work in collaborative symbiosis with their hosts to aid digestion and monitor immune health. There is no barrier between humans and nature, no outside to which we do not belong. Instead, there is a garden of interdependent aliens, and it is the recognition of this alienation that will be crucial in making Earth a second home.
Wow. Thank you. Wow, that was such a complex project. I don't know, Ben, if you have like 10
Sure.
more.
I have as much. Yeah, I have time for discussion if you like. I just wanted to also, for those who were watching, we did 8 more projects like that. And so if you go to the Strelka Institute, you go to the Strelka Institute YouTube page, you'll be able to see that. I can also send you that link and you can pass it on to everyone. I also just one last point about the program. It's a 5-month research program. The program is tuition free. We actually pay the researchers to be in residence as part of the program, and we are going to be doing the terraforming for 2 more years, at least at the institute. The applications for the second year will go online later this summer and early fall. And so I would invite your program's participants to consider applying to ours if the ideas in the work are appealing to them.
Thank you. We hope that some of them will give it a try. I would like to participate someday.
But yeah, I do too. One of my real regret with the program is that I don't get to be a researcher in the program. I don't get to be in the classes that I'm not teaching. So I definitely would anyone who's interested, please consider joining us.
Is any like age limitation to participate?
25 to 35 is kind of the area that we're looking in. It is a postgraduate program, and so for the most part, many of our participants have some kind of they have a graduate degree or some kind of professional experience one way or another. I mean, it's not written in stone. We've had people who are 20, 23. We've had people who are 38, but that's generally the area which we have it. 25 to 35.
Thank you.
Let me. I think this is the chat here. I don't know if I can.
Yeah, I have a first questions. I don't know if they.
I just put the YouTube link to all of the. So let me say, the link that I've just put in the chat window here, which if you want to pass it on to your participants, is a playlist which has the videos to all 9 projects, introductions that I gave to each of the 9 projects, as well as keynotes from Kim Stanley Robinson, Helen Hester, Jussi Parikka, and Lisa Masseri, who were faculty in the program. So it's a good, get some popcorn because it's a good 7 hours of content.
Yeah, I just sent it. I have the first question from Jorge Camacho, who asks, I know that an element of the terraforming brief was to step out of human-centered or even human-scaled preoccupations. Still, in most of the otherwise great terraforming projects, something that seemed missing was a look at the everyday life, at how good people live. The dimension of everyday life is a concern of other emerging practices such as transition design. Key Ace Robinson mentioned it briefly that redesign of lifestyles could be seen as terraforming. Can a redesign of everyday life even domesticity be part of the terraforming project?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, for sure. I guess I would, I quite agree with the question's notion that that what might be called everyday life can be part of this part of the terraforming outcome, as Stan articulated it as well. It's a bit of a complex question. I on the one hand, the issues of things that are very, very small and very, very intimate and close to our own person and close to our own body and close to how it is that the world comes in contact with each of us is in many respects just as important as things that are happening at a continental scale. But I guess in some ways the next step really, I think, is a sort of critique of the logic of the differentiation of scale that would imply. You know, like Helen Hester was one of the faculty in the program, and her work around reproductive technologies, for example, and a notion that she's put forward as a kind of complement to the terraforming initiative, which she calls anthropoforming, which is the remaking of the organism to suit its own sort of environmental conditions, is one that shows that even things that are happening at what might appear to be a very small scale are intimately linked with other kinds of processes that are happening at a planetary or continental scale, such that you can't really necessarily make a strong break or distinction between them. And the inverse would be equally true then, that things that are happening and processes that are happening at a continental scale are also simultaneously happening at this very intimate scale. The way in which I would sort of put this, though, is that this understanding this interrelationship between scales is exactly, in many ways, the kind of definition of the planetary that would differentiate it from the notion of the global. Whereas the global would refer, as we have it, would refer to the kind of singular frozen image of a planet, you know, fixed. Whereas planetarity implies already this recursive dynamic between the micrological and the macrological as operating in ways that are undisentangleable from one another. And so for this, then the question of the question of scale is would be framed in this particular kind of way. Now, the question of the everyday is maybe somewhat different than this. If the everyday is meant to imply things that are, I guess the one more question on scale. What this implies then is that a macrological scale, things that are beyond anthropometric natural perception. You know, we as a species, we evolved to have a certain kind of, you know, we're a certain number of feet tall. We can see the horizon at particular angles. We have a particular kind of stereoscopic vision. We can see certain things up close, but not too close. And so mechanisms like telescopes and microscopes allowed for a transformation of perception, and thereby a transformation of what's all around us. And so a microscope, for example, allows us to see something that's very, 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 very small. It's much smaller than we would even be able to perceive it normally, but it's equally alien, if not even more alien, than the things that we would perceive that would be very, very large through a telescope. And so, you know, microscopes didn't invent microbes, but once you know that they're there because of what microscopes allow for, you never see surfaces the same way again. Those intimate surfaces around you become quite different. They become different things because of this, the way in which they've become technically disenchanted by this, or revealed to operate in ways that are different than the way we would do so. And so that is to say that the question of human scale, the way in which we would want to sort of would imply is that which is much smaller than human scale is of equal interest to us, to things that are much larger than human scale. But what we're not doing, in essence, is privileging the anthropometric scale, natural possession, as some kind of essential, necessary grounding phenomenological grounding point from which these other kinds of very, very small or very, very large things could be brought to heal or could be made to conform to the natural phenomenological scale of intuitive human perception, as if this natural phenomenal scale of human perception were somehow our proper place, were somehow, you know, the register of interaction with the world to which we should return, in which we are naturally situated, that is more, in fact, sort of somehow more noble and authentic than these other relationships that, in fact, might be more alien to as well. And so it's exactly a problematization of the anthropometric scale as a natural philosophical grounding point that is part of our part of our work. The everyday, as it was construed in Dussert-Ho, for example, could mean a few different things. One is it could mean the kinds of patterns of action and patterns of process that can be extremely complex, you know, with even just like within a very small territory, within one's own room, let alone one's building or one's block or one's city, that there's an infinite amount of complexity in what is very, very close at hand. And that many times the processes of that complexity are not things that we have formal words for, that they are in essence under-identified, under-conceptualized, that their complexity is overlooked in some way. And to the extent to which we would want to no longer overlook that complexity and understand it for its beauty, I'm very much, you know, this initiative for the everyday is very much, we're very much for. If the everyday, however, is understood as the kind of, the sort of apparentness of things, that there's a certain way in which things appear to us, that we understand it works in a particular way, that we have a kind of unconscious, doxic, naturalized, culturally overdetermined relationship to those processes, that is something we inherit, something we reproduce, and that again, that cultural overdetermining of the way in which we understand these processes is itself reified or naturalized as some kind of proper register by which our own authenticity can be calibrated and to which we should return, then no, I think I think this ultimately leads in directions that are quite reactionary, and is one that is separate, that one would be would diverge from where I think we are going.
Thank you, Ben. One more question, because you were talking about, like, yeah, culture can be considered a fiction, and because at some point in your essay you said that terraforming is anti-myth, no, but anti-mythology,
anti-myth, yeah.
And I was wondering, like if you had said that we can design our planet, we can redesign our planet, we can redesign our epistemology, our way of perceiving scales, can we redesign mythology or culture to fit in this, to merge into this, like, kind of infrastructure nature that you are kind of proposing here?
Sure. I mean, I think you saw this a bit with the Black Almanac project here as well. I mean, there was an argument that's in this project that is referring not only to how it is that we would recompose food at the level of a menu, but also food at the level of agriculture, but also food at the level of the culture by which the culture that in a way had particular logics, particular demands, particular structures that is both the cause and the effect. It's both the cause and the effect of the current agricultural systems that we have in place, now. You know, I think, you know, part of the way in which we would try, in a certain sense, there's a more Marxist, I suppose, approach to what we're doing, that the idea that the kinds of cultures that get produced are, to a greater extent, we are emphasizing the ways in which they are effects of the socioeconomic system. It's a kind of base superstructure kind of understanding of this. On the other hand, I think it's quite clear that cultures are material facts, that the organization of systems and the signification, that the articulation of signs and the consumption of signs are physical phenomena in and of themselves. They are culture is part of how complex adaptive systems signal to themselves. Culture is part of how complex adaptive systems organize themselves and understand themselves and share information between each other. And so the understanding of culture as an information system, as part of how, and is one in which our species has evolved in relationship to. We evolved, mammals, not even, all form, the mammals more generally have evolved in relationship to a complex capacity for the abstraction of information and the communication of information in particular ways. Obviously, plants and other kinds of things exchange information in other sorts of ways as well. But the idea of we would see an important role for culture, but we would define culture in a much more materialist sense, even physicalist sense, than taking it as a kind of free-floating, immaterial, virtual, transcendental realm of meaning that is somehow separate from and above all of the kind of dirty work that's happening below. And unfortunately, I think that one of the ways in which the nature-culture divide has been constructed and enforced within the Western tradition is to see culture in exactly those terms, and to see culture as a kind of transcendental, immaterial pursuit for its own sake. And that it's a kind of culture is the kind of experience, not just the experience of the world, but the experience of our experience of the world. And if you set in motion a condition by which a species believes that its experience of the world and its own experience of the world is a transcendental good in and of itself, and should be pursued for its own sake. It's how you get to something like the Anthropocene, where the world is understood as just there for us to experience and to make meaning out of. It seems to be a kind of it should be expected that we would end up in that place.
Thanks. Well, I have one more. Well, we have one more question of one of the participants.
I can do as many questions as you like, so whatever you want. So.
Cool. Jordi Villader Guerrero asks, the disarticulation of the culture-nature debate has been a common trope through history, parting from the Garden of Eden to sculpted nature, think medieval naturalistic design patterns. In this sense, your proposal can be read almost as religious or teleological at the least, describing technical systems as the planet's reflexive mechanism, or even the notion of artificiality as traces of design. So what's the relationship of your project with this tradition?
I'm not sure quite understand. Our project could be understood as a kind of religious or theological gesture. Is that the sense? I didn't quite get the whole sense of the argument, or rather that the critique of nature culture the nature culture divide is as old as the nature culture divide itself. And how is our project related to those earlier criticisms of this problem?
Yeah, I think that at the beginning he was putting the context, but the main question is, if in which extent your project is teleological, describing technical systems as the planet reflexive mechanisms, or even the notion of artificiality as traces of design. Yeah, it's about the teleological nature of your project.
I don't know that it is teleological. I need a little more understanding of the question. I I think part of the art, I mean, in a way, we're trying to sort of move as further away from that away from this as we can. The idea that somehow that let's say just sort of compare what we're doing to like the way Latour invokes Gaia as a kind of mythical figure of a kind of singularly sentient totality of the planet itself, as a kind of, is basically, it's a secular God figure. It sort of plugs nicely into the place where God used to go, within particularly French Catholic traditions, of which he's involved, and it allows for him to, in essence, speak of the goodness of nature without having to speak of the goodness of nature, since he spent the rest of his career arguing against this. When we talk about ways in which the planet comes to know itself, we mean this in ways that are not only particularly looking at contemporary technologies, but rather at something like a kind of physicalist or materialist theory of intelligence and cognition more generally. That how it is that even in that, think of it this way, is that matter can organize itself in lots of different ways, and some of the ways it organizes itself are able to produce phenomenon that we would recognize as sentient. So we would recognize as some form of intelligence. The human model of this, the way in which this happened within the Homo genus over the last few million years, and then Homo sapiens over the last 100,000 or 150, and then modern cognitive humans in the last 40,000, is by no means the norm, is by no means even the central model for how this would work. Whether it's from other animals, from ants to dolphins to chimpanzees to whatever, that matter can fold itself to produce different forms of intelligence. Cuttlefish, cephalopods, matter can form different forms of intelligence in lots of different ways. It has been doing so for far longer than there have ever been anything like humans on the Earth. In other words, we would understand that intelligence is not only a kind of is something that emerges biologically in a lot of different ways, but ultimately below that, it's something that emerges chemically, something that emerges physically, that it's a kind of geological phenomenon, that in the history and the career of a planet, one of the things that our planet has done in the way in which it's cultivated a biological structure along its crust is to fold its matter and to calculate its matter in certain ways that it produces these different forms of intelligence. Now, human intelligence and more human intelligence has been one of its more successful, in certain ways, one of its more successful experiments in this ways, and was even able to, by 1953, were able to figure out how old the Earth was. 4.7 billion years old. So in that the planet was able to figure out its own age by folding matter in a particular way, waiting long enough for the monkeys to figure it out. And eventually the planet figured out how old it was by this kind of process, which is an interesting thing for the planet to do. And so I don't know that there's any necessary, I don't think there's it's unsure whether there's any sort of any necessary trajectory to this process. Kojev is someone that has been of interest to us quite a bit in terms of different ways of thinking about universality and reason, but I guess I'm not quite sure what the questioner's interest is around the question of teleology, as if this is heading in a particular direction. The question of AI then needs to be understood also as a form of material intelligence. That another way in which matter can fold itself is using inorganic material. Obviously, you've got a biological species is folding inorganic material, running electricity through it, and now you have inorganic machines that are able to produce something we would recognize as a different kind of sentience, not a human sentience, but a different kind of calculative capacity. And so our definition of AI is not as some transcendental, angelic realm of pure mind, but quite the opposite. It's a geological phenomenon, one that has been organized. It's a way of making rocks think. That is organized in this way. Anyway, so that's my little riff on the question of intelligence. But if the questioner wants to follow up with more specific notion, further explication around the question of teleology, I'd be happy to entertain it.
Well, meanwhile, we wait if we have like further information about this question. I have another one of Pablo de Soto, who is one of the persons who is kind of taking care of one of the working groups, the technological democratization, and he asks, you mentioned fourth generation nuclear reactors as an interesting technology in planetary design. Can you comment on how nuclear technology was addressed in the 2020 terraforming program?
Sure. So we're the question of energy sources and where it is that the energy is going to come from, and the relationship of waste, in particular, is one that is what we were interested in, and how it is that we could that an understanding that any energy system is going to produce but necessarily going to produce waste. And so part of what we were interested in was how it is that we could develop a much longer term understanding of those energy waste cycles that would allow for a more reasonable planned management of those cycles. Given the idea now is that our current moment in which it's sort of dependent upon fossil fuel and different kinds of economies of extraction, is that we have energy sources that took hundreds of millions of years to gestate in the forms of fossil fuels, which we've managed to extract and light on fire in just a matter of couple generations. The waste byproducts of that energy system are invisible, are anonymous, are atmospheric, and they basically float up into the atmosphere in the form of CO2 and carbon and heat, and are causing the problem that we have. And so it's this so-called externality of fossil fuel that has been this sort of obvious problem. And to some extent, it's based on a kind of a long-term an energy source that took a very long time to produce, a very short time to extinguish, and this sort of invisible and anonymous waste that becomes very, very impossible to govern, partially because it's so diffuse. And CO2 is generally, entropically distributed inside the atmosphere. And so one of the things we began thinking about was what would the opposite of this be, but a very long-term energy system that would allow for longer-term planning and longer-term cycles around this as well, and how this might sort itself out. You'd also want energy sources that require less material extraction than fossil fuels do, and obviously solar and wind. Solar in particular requires a lot of mineral extraction. Solar is great. We like solar. There's nothing wrong with any of these, but really getting off of coal and fossil fuels is really the main issue here. So nuclear presents itself as an interesting option here, and certainly within the sort of climate policy and climate activist groups, so people are taking another look at nuclear, despite some of its cultural, its negative cultural connotations. That able to produce an enormous amount of energy at with much less carbon costs than fossil fuels. The issue with nuclear power is in many cases largely issues of safety and issues of waste. So first is that in many cases that if you actually look at the math and the statistics on nuclear plants and the number of injuries, the number of deaths, the number of health-related crises that have been resulted from nuclear issues, that it's actually per capita much safer than many other options. If you think of it in terms of that, it's the worst nuclear accident in our lifetimes, in hopefully in our lifetimes in Chernobyl. The numbers are the number of people who died from this measured in the hundreds, perhaps thousands, over the entire course of this. The number of people who die from coal and coal-related issues every year is at least 3 million. Chernobyl is measured in the hundreds, perhaps low thousands. The number of people who died from radiation-related sicknesses in Fukushima was at most likely zero. other than the people who had to go to the plant. And so in many cases, the safety record is actually one that is better than other kinds of issues. Technically speaking, more people die from wind energy from nuclear because of installation accidents. But the longer issue really has to do with waste. Now, conventional nuclear plants, as you know, produce fuel rod waste. The older model plants, the designs from the 50s and the 60s, really produce a little waste. Now, in theory, this wouldn't be so much of a problem, other than like the United States. It's a kind of we had a plan for sequestering this waste inside salt mines in Yucca Mountain for various political reasons. This didn't go forward, and so in many cases the waste actually sits on site at the plant itself, which is extremely dangerous and extremely insane, to be honest. But in a technical level, there's no reason we couldn't sequester this waste more easily. Now, the thing with nuclear waste, as opposed to here's the issue. The thing with nuclear waste, as opposed to the waste from fossil fuels, where fossil fuel creates waste that is also extremely long-term, operates over, it dissipates over hundreds of thousands of years ultimately, but it's invisible, it's anonymous, and it's pervasive, which means it's ultimately unaccountable. That the issue, who's responsible for the waste that fossil fuels produce? Nobody is responsible, and everybody is responsible. So in essence, waste is just not dealt with at all. We just don't deal with it. And this is, you can calculate on your own terms how many lives are taken or reduced in relationship to this indirect problem, and compare it to other options. Counterintuitively, for sure, nuclear waste is, among other things, is discrete, it's dense, it's extremely visible, and therefore it's, in essence, it's hyper accountable. Like, you just can't pretend it's not there. You have to do something with it. And it lasts a very long time, but with the idea of a longer term energy infrastructure, the idea that the waste that we already have waste that we are producing from our energy systems that will last much longer than any of us will be alive, it's just invisible, and so we don't really deal with it. If we had waste that would last as long, but it's actually accountable, then in theory, there's the possibility for ways to actually govern this waste that are more direct. And that would be so. Now, clearly, that would involve a kind of transformation in how it is that our own interest and will and culture for actually governing our energy systems. But I think we've all come to the conclusion that there's no way out of our predicament that does not also involve a radical transformation of our politics of energy, and the culture and economics of energy as well. And so I think that should be taken as sort of a given. Now, the question about next generation nuclear power plants is apropos here, in that, I mean, you can look this up here as you like, but there are alternative designs for smaller reactors that are much safer, and that they can't melt down in the same way that older reactors would. If somehow they lost power, instead of melting down like the Chernobyl or Fukushima or something like that, they would simply turn off, and then you would in essence have to restart them. They use thorium instead of uranium. They can actually use the waste from earlier nuclear power plants as their fuel. So the next generation plants could be using the uranium, the fuel rod waste as part of their fuel. There's lots of interest in this. Most of it, all of this works in proof of concept, but part of the issue again comes down to economics. It's the plants are, on the one hand, the plants are expensive to produce, so there's a lot of upfront costs. But once they're produced, they're able to produce energy in a very, very low carbon way, and then it's the economics of this for a power utility are unclear. The economics of this for building this for public sources is unclear. But in many respects, the technical side of this is the one that is sort of worked out. So it's a long answer to a sort of general question. The way in which we dealt with it in the program more generally was in terms of thinking about waste systems within energy systems, how it is that the governance of waste, everything is sort of like, that's what it all comes down to. And governance of waste that is discrete and tangible but lasts a very long time is not something that we should be afraid of. And that clearly that the transformation in essence, the political economy of energy between the North and the South, between the city and the country, between the present and the future, that this is really where our attention needs to go. And if it does, then it may lead us in other directions. I mean, last point on this is, if you look at the history of energy use in humans, it's gone from very, very low density material that has it's gone from energy that has a very, very large volume, but very, very low energy, contained energy, like wood, to something that is a sort of medium volume and medium energy output, like a piece of coal. And in theory, what you want is something that is very, very low volume, but very, very high energy density. And so some of the elements like thorium and uranium, natural occurring elements like thorium and uranium, are logical points of exploration for that as well. So anyway, there's other issues around this to be discussed, but I would want to know a little bit more what the direction is that you would be relevant.
Okay, thank you. I have another question of Cecilia Resende. As she says, is there a proportional relationship between centralization and accountability in relation to infrastructure, energy sources, and planning?
Between centralization and accountability for what exactly?
Yeah, there is a proportional relationship between centralization and accountability in relation to infrastructure, energy sources, and planning.
No, I think it's more complicated than that. I think that one of the ways, I think that there's ways in which that we can easily overly dichotomize centralization versus decentralization in ways in which they might seem exclusive to one another. And I think, in fact, they are the ways in which we see many platform systems operating. They're actually closely dependent upon one another. If let's take, for example, something like Android, the Android operating system. On the one hand, we could see it as a highly centralized process by which there's the information that is sensed by an Android device, that's organized by an Android device, that is pushed to an Android device through a search query or something, is all happening in the big Google mothership as it's imagined to be, and then pushed out to lots of different things. That Google is at the center of this mobile infrastructural system, and everything is sucked back into this center so that it can be pushed back out again and have to sort of to work. So this would imply that something like the mobile operating system is a highly centralized phenomenon. At the same time, what we're talking about is a software architecture that in certain ways is as decentralized as can be. It exists as, in essence, as OS/clients on literally billions and billions of devices that are sent out across the surface of the world as free range, as a sort of free range trajectories where users drag them around across the surface of the planet, and in any way they wish, interacting with them through interface elements at any point in time, anywhere, introducing transactions of information between different points in one way or another. In other words, the aspects of Android that are highly centralized are dependent upon these decentralized, the decentralized phenomenon. The decentralized aspects are in fact dependent upon the centralized aspect. You can't, in that case, you can't have one without the other. Now, the question though the person asked was about accountability, which is an enormously interesting question. I think it can be taken in a few different ways, though. There's accountability might imply that certain things are like in accounting, that something that happens is registered, that it's identified, indexed, addressed, registered, quantified, compared, in essence, accounted for in some kind of way. And so the history of accounting generalized accounting principles, so forth and so on, has its own peculiar ontology of what kinds of things count, what counts to be accounted for, and how do we add it up to a certain kind of mechanism. Now, for that kind of process to work, there has to be some kind of standardization of what counts and what is accounted for. And so there's an account, a company in Spain has its accounting books and a company in Japan has its accounting books. And someone in Russia could look at both of these accounting books and make some kind of comparison between these companies because there's a standardization of accounting principles as to what counts. So that standardization to a certain extent could be understood as a kind of, at least a sort of formal standardization, whether it's a centralization, it's unsure. Now, there's the other connotation of accountability has to do with a kind of accountability and enforcement. That is, that if you were to do that, if someone or something was to do something in some way that is pathological to the whole, that it suffers some consequences for this. That there is accountability for accountability for actions in this particular kind of way. And the accountability for those actions would be dependent upon some capacity for identification of something as being pernicious, negative, unacceptable, and enforcement of some sanction in response to that. Now, I think that can happen in a way that is, depending on how you look at it, would be either decentralized at certain levels, then centralized at a higher level, then decentralized at another level, and all of these in between. I think we can find lots of examples where you have disconnected and decentralized phenomenon that are totally unaccountable, that they are able to, in essence, act without accountability. That they, in essence, that some of them might be seen as a kind of autonomy, as a kind of freedom, but also as sites of it can be sites of extraordinary cruelty and violence. We can also see lots of examples of the same thing happening in centralized systems. So I guess I would want to again ask a little bit more about I get a sense that the questioner has a specific examples in mind as to what qualifies it, what means a centralized system or a decentralized system in their thought, whether they mean like blockchains versus nation states, centralized currency versus decentralized currency, and the connotation of accounting for either of them. But I might be able to answer the question more generously and specifically if I had a little bit more sense of what they had in mind.
Yeah, Cecilia was talking in particular about energy sources.
Oh, well, okay. So for energy sources, so from my sense is some of it comes down to, I think the issue here has to do with I think more importantly, the issue has to do with the democratization of the technology, frankly, to the question going sort of before. I'm of the opinion that basic usable energy, clean, low carbon, usable energy and electricity is at this point should be freely available to everyone. That in north, south, equator, that everyone should have access to the energy necessary to construct the lives that they want, that they want to lead. Things like clean water, education, healthcare. Energy is one of the things that is, I think, at this point we need to be we should understand as a fundamental part of a viable planetary social democratic society platform and society. Energy should be free, or at least democratically available. It should be democratized in that way. The mechanisms to do that are ones in which the economies of scale can allow for that in ways that are quite clear. If you have energy that is produced where you have a large amount of energy that is produced at a particular site and then equitably and rationally distributed to those who need it, the economies of scale will allow for more democratic access to the energy sources. The alternatives on the other end of the spectrum microgrids, location-based solar, wind, other sorts of things as well. Great. I've no issue with these as well. But if someone is capable and is able to incur the infrastructure costs on their own to produce their own energy system within their environment, to take on the risk of privatizing the risk of the infrastructural investment necessary to produce their own energy, okay. I think in the long run, the path towards a real democratization of energy access is to socialize that risk of the infrastructural investment in such a way that individual economic actors are not individually responsible. So neoliberal actors are not individually responsible for the infrastructural investment of risk for something that should be provided as a kind of basic utility. And so centralization of infrastructure is also a kind of socialization of the risk of that infrastructural investment in ways that have democratic aspects to it. The decentralization can also be a kind of privatization or at least individualization of the infrastructural risk necessary to do so. But like I said, there's other ways in which we can talk about the extraction dependencies of solar panels, the mineral cycles, the inability to properly downcycle and recycle solar, but this is a whole different thing. Solar is fine. If someone wants to create microgrids and sort of produce their own little, to secede from the social network, the social bond of energy that ties them together, go ahead. But I think that the path towards greater democratization comes from economies of scale.
Thank you. One more question, the last one. Could you develop a little bit on this emergency sovereignty? Because I understand that you're talking about like a planetary sovereignty, that there is a need of planetary sovereignty to face those challenges, but then the political structure is not able to tackle them. So,
right. So as I mentioned, I think that the notion of sovereignty is something that gets dealt with in a number of different ways in my work, and I'm not sure they're all reducible to a kind of general meta theory of sovereignty. But in the specific one that you identify here, I'd be happy to speak to. And it plays on this in English and other languages as well. This slide between emergency and emergence, that the emergencies that are also produce the conditions of emergence, or in fact they are conditions of emergence, rather than just states of draconian exception. And that one of the ways in which we have, I think, can identify historically some of the ways in which new modes of sovereignty and new forms of sovereign actors have appeared historically is not through not through a kind of procedural process, but in response to an emergency, that they have in fact emerged in a particular way. I think logics of revolution would certainly count here in some ways as well, that there's a kind of a moment of a fundamental radical destabilization of a political order. There might be, the early revolutionaries might have a plan for what comes next, which is usually not actually what comes next. What emerges from the situation emerges on, according to its own logics. But what I was talking about here, the examples I was sort of using were things like the Association of Island States at the IPCC negotiations, where you have a number of countries that are near the equator. Many of them are islands, but many of the groups, Association of Island States, are not islands. They're just equatorial. And what is tying them together as a common political actor and a common political agency is that the predicament in relationship to climate change that they share is the danger of sea level rise, of drowning. And so their common agency is constructed in relationship to their common predicament in relationship to this emergency. they have different issues than those for whom the existential crisis of climate change may have to do with loss of agricultural capacity, or may have to do with population migration issues. It has to do, in their case, it has to do with sea level rise and the existential cost of literally drowning. So they bounded together in relationship to, we are those who are about to drown. And now the history of these locations, whether or not they're islands in the South Pacific, that they're near the that they're coastal cities in North Africa, that they are or wherever it might be, they don't have any necessary historical relationship to one another in the same ways, let's say, a colonial power and a post-colonial power have in a kind of bonded relationship with each other, say like France and Africa, or the United States and Latin America. Their links together are not based on the heritage of these past few hundred years. Their link together is based on their common relationship to this emergency situation. And the appearance and articulation of their political agency as a coherent common political actor is constructed in this way. And so the larger point that I'm trying to make here, other than identifying these peculiar new forms of common political agency in relationship to common relationships to climate change, has to do simply with, like, at a certain point we should presume that the geopolitical architecture and the geoeconomic architecture that we operate under, if we're seeing it ways and sort of creaking against its own capacities to actually govern the situation as it stands, then the kind of new world order that we would anticipate, that we would want to bring about in the future, would be one that may be brought about through an accumulation of these emergencies, an accumulation of these collapse points, and ultimately an accumulation, not in an accelerationist sort of, let's run everything to the end and blow it all up and whatever happens next. That's really not what I'm saying. But rather that in the emergence of these these other sort of like common positions, that the map will be redrawn, that the order will be reconstructed, and that these are where we should be pointing our attentions, both analytically and practically.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, I could stay all night long discussing with you. I guess that some of the participants as well, but we should finish at some point. So, well, I would like to thank you in behalf of all the participants and the audience that has been enjoying your talk and this very generous round of questions.
Sure. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks to speaking with you. I normally for me the question, the Q&A part is usually much more interesting part of the discussion, where we can actually sort of get into the nitty gritty, and oftentimes it works better when we have a bit of a back and forth where question can be asked and then answered and then re-asked, and we might actually we can discover something together. And so with that in mind, I would go ahead and pass along my email to any of your participants. If they have follow-up questions, or they don't feel that I answered their question thoroughly or misunderstood their question, please, I invite you to ask again on that point. I would also invite you to, as I passed along the YouTube playlist for the 7 hours of work or so from the terraforming program. I think a lot of the implications of the theory, I think, are worked out there, and I certainly would also invite your comments on the work that we've done. The terraforming book, I posted the Dropbox link for that. Please go ahead and download it for free as you like and read it there as well. But again, this is a conversation. The terraforming conversation is one that I invite all of you into in different ways. The multiplicity of perspectives and interest and agenda up for the project is what will make it work well or poorly. And so you're all, please feel free to join. And also consider, the research program that's based in Moscow next year. If this is of interest to you and you think that taking 5 months to go deeper into this is something you'd like to consider, please do so as well.
Will do. And we will keep the discussion alive using different platforms.
Great. Let me know. Please summarize for me where the conversation goes so I can learn from you as well.
Cool. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll be reading you online.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'll see everyone soon. Again, drop me a line if you like. Talk to you soon. Bye. Stay safe.
Bye.